This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Dan O'Brien, K-State grain economist, and Guy Allen, the senior economist at the IGP Institute, kick off today's show with a grain market outlook. In their first segment, they provide an overview and also discuss supply and demand for corn and grain sorghum. Continuing the show is Dan O'Brien and Guy Allen in their second segment conversing about wheat and soybeans, while Guy also mentions macroeconomic changes. K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond in today's show as he provides a weather forecast for Kansas. He talks about the temperature changes and if he expects a white Christmas. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Friday show with a grain market update with K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien and the senior economist at the IGP Institute at K-State, Guy Allen. Dan, Guy, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you there, Shelby.
Dan, as we look at the grain market, wanting to begin with just an overview of what we're seeing domestically.
Yeah. Of course, we're following up on that Tuesday, December 10th USDA World Ag Supply Demand Estimates report. And from just the broadest of overviews, most of the U.S. supply demand balance sheets just had minor changes, except on corn. There's something important there that occurred in terms of the tightening up of U.S. ending stocks that has important implications for where we go in 2025. And also, as my good colleague Guy Allen will also talk about on the world supply demand balance sheet for corn and feed grains, some major changes there too. So interesting to look at that. NASS production data came in. There's a little bit of information on cotton and sugarcane. This report sets us up or bridges the gap till the next time when the USDA comes in with a lot of data, grain stocks reports, wheat, winter wheat seeding, and the final production estimate numbers, basically the annual production summaries for all U.S. crops for 2024. So there's a lot of potential for movement in that January report. So December kind of bridges the gap between the last set of NASS numbers in November and then all this data that comes in, the potential for a lot of volatility in the January reports. And then there was there are things happening in the world oilseed markets. Malaysian palm oil production was lowered on poor growing conditions, including a massive. There's a major rain event that came in late November through peninsular Malaysia, led to a lot of flooding, affected things, and it's had kind of a boomerang effect on U.S. soybean oil exports. So you've got things happening in that market. Also some things happening in cotton. India, cotton production raised due to higher yields from good growing conditions. So overall, you got that happening. So here we set on Friday, look at yesterday's closes in the market, and we have the March 25 contract at 443.5, and we've certainly been lower than that, 30 cents lower than that at times in the fall. So we've seen some movement to the higher side. In fact, in the corn market, we listen to what the technical people are saying, they say that they're pretty hesitant, or the market's pretty hesitant about going over $4.50 in some of these contracts. So that's a technical issue, Guy, that you can comment on. And then you've got D's 25 corn at 440, basically 442, just under that. And so that's going forth. And for soybeans, January soybeans 9.95 3/4. November next year 10.14. Hard red winter wheat for March 25 5.62 3/4. July harvest contract 5.78. Again, most U.S. producers to meet their break-even costs are looking for something with a 6 in front of it, but it's not $4 anyway. So it's 5.50, 5.75 for wheat. So, Guy, before we head off into some of the details domestically, any comments on what you've seen in that report?
Yeah, just looking at corn, as you said, that's sort of where it's happened. On the global situation, ending stocks were down for total coarse grains, about 6.6 million tons. Corn ending stocks were down 7.7 million tons to about just under 300 million. That's 20 million tons below last year's ending stocks. So we're seeing things tighten up. I was a bit surprised. I'm probably a bit more bullish today than what the USDA report reflected. We're seeing dry weather on a number of places around the world as we go into northern hemisphere planting, and your planting in South America's and South Africa has been delayed a bit because of dry weather. So I think there's a bit more production risk underlying there, particularly for corn. And the USDA, as you and I always talk, is a bit slow to respond to that. But I think that if we're patient, we're going to see these markets rally a bit.
And they indicated that in the U.S. supply-demand balance sheet, which ended up bringing together higher ethanol production, higher exports. Well, they raised the projection of U.S. ethanol usage by 50 million bushels of corn up to 5.5 billion, and exports by 150 million up to 2.475 billion. Ending stocks were lowered from 1.938 billion down to 1.738. So 200 million less stocks. Stocks to use tightening up from about 12, 13 up down to just a little over 11. And yet with all that, and I guess this is indicative of the conservatism as you're talking about, the USDA. They made those changes but didn't touch the price forecast, and he's still 410. So I would wonder about that going forward. Go ahead, Guy.
Yeah, just looking at some of those import numbers, like you say, they left those unchanged. Europe, they did have less exports, more imports there. That makes me, I'm a bit more optimistic on the trade there. I was just in South Africa last week, actually, on a U.S. Grains Council trade mission. Not only South Africa, but that whole sub-Saharan Africa area is quite dry. South Africa is usually an exporter of 2.5 to 3.5 million tons of corn. They're going to be importing, I reckon, 1.5 million tons of corn this year, particularly food-grade corn. They consume that domestically for food. The first small shipment arrived there last week, and they're still sort of looking around trying to buy more white corn specifically. And because of that tightness and the increase in domestic price of food-grade corn, I think we'll see some of that demand shift over into wheat. South Africa always imports about 2 million tons of wheat, but I think their wheat imports will be up 500,000 tons, as well as a couple boatloads of soybeans have been booked to go into that area as well. And I think that's just a bit of microcosm of what we could potentially see with the dry weather in China, as well as in the dry weather we're seeing in Europe and Eastern Europe there as well. So I think there's some things developing. A good rain will sort of solve things pretty quick. But, if this La Nina pattern generates, as I think they're saying it will, that would put some of those countries at risk.
La Nina, is that what you said?
Yeah, La Nina. It just treats different areas differently. So
right. You mentioned China, and when we think about corn, we're not really worried about the potential, and they're certainly not showing anything like that in what the December WASDE report showed. But there's concern about U.S.-China trade tensions. There's not so much on corn. China will buy periodically amounts of corn, but really are concerned about that in general in the markets for grain sorghum. But remains to be seen how that there's a lot of signaling going on. The U.S. grain sorghum balance sheet didn't change any, still projecting 220 million bushels of U.S. grain sorghum exports this year. And we had 239 last year, 109 the year ahead of that. So I guess we'll see where that all goes. It is noteworthy that at a recent BRICS meeting, again, the countries that were considering forming another currency other than the U.S. to trade and do business upon, that the leader of China discussed with the leaders of Brazil opening up Brazilian, I guess, trying to bring more Brazilian sorghum into the country. Probably we'd look at that as maybe a substitute for U.S. sorghum. However, if that happens, there's a direct effect. Well, yeah, maybe China, if they can do that, that'd be fine. I've dug into that back behind the scenes for some sorghum meetings last week we were involved in here in Kansas. And right now, Brazil exports no sorghum. They use it all domestically, all of it.
Interesting on that, there was one shipment of Brazilian sorghum that went into South Africa recently, and I've been getting increasing questions about the potential for Brazilian production of sorghum. And I sort of quietly think Brazil's a lot like U.S. farmers. They'll produce whatever the price shows them on that. And they're having a bit of dry weather down there. And so I think that's why it's getting a bit of look. So I think, from a Brazilian threat, sorghum's as much at risk as corn and soybeans on that. And I think second half, we'll talk a bit about why the U.S. is the residual storer of grain, and Brazil liquidates their production as fast as they can every year. But we'll talk about that in a bit.
There's a direct effect of that. Well, yeah, perhaps that sorghum doesn't go to ethanol plants and domestic uses out of Brazil and goes elsewhere, but then they still have those plants established, and they're using, they're increasing their domestic biofuels production. So if they don't use sorghum in those plants, then it's got to be corn.
The thing to keep in mind with ethanol in Brazil, sugar is the big ethanol component, and the grain side's sort of supplemental. But yeah, you're exactly right. Once they've got the plants built, they've got to grind something, and they will produce something. So that will increase that domestic demand in Brazil itself, which I don't think that's a good thing. The interesting thing on that ethanol is, I'm fairly bearish oil prices on the back of the new administration, drill, baby, drill. I would expect those prices to continue to come down, approach $50 a barrel. What's that do for ethanol margins in the U.S.? I was having that conversation this week. I think the margins have been pretty healthy the last 2 years. I think they're going to narrow up, but they'll still remain positive because the blending mandates are still there. And that ethanol, as you mentioned earlier, that demand is going to be steady to slightly higher. So that demand's still going to be there for the U.S., which is good.
Dan, Guy, we're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today. But when we come back, we'll once again be joined by both of you as we continue our grain market conversation. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our show and conversation with K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien and the senior economist at the IGP Institute, Guy Allen, as we discuss the grain market. Continuing our conversation, Dan, what are we seeing for wheat on the domestic side of things?
Coming out of that December 10th report, there were a few minor changes in the supply-demand balance sheet. Basically, export projection for this year raised about 25 million bushels up to 850, so not a major change. A little bit of a increase of 5 million bushels in imports. Ending stocks projected to be 795 million bushels. That's down 20 from the November numbers, but still up almost 100 million from year prior in 23-24 marketing year. And price projection unchanged at $5.60. We averaged last year in 23-24, $6.96, so still a sizable drop, $1.35 to $1.40 drop thereabouts. And as far as the world situation for wheat went, not a lot of major changes. Really the biggest thing that's noteworthy for wheat, I think, is in the broader macro sense. Guy, and I'll kick this over to you, in that world wheat ending stocks for the 24-25 marketing year of 258 million metric tons, down about 9.5 million metric tons from previous year. And we've got a whole lot of uncertainty about the Black Sea region, Russia, Ukraine, all sorts of things. Any thoughts and comments on that?
Looking at the wheat situation, it was probably neutral. I'd say we're looking at big production. We're going to have a record production again this year of wheat. We're going to have good demand there as well. As you said, global ending stocks are up slightly, but there are concerns, particularly I think in Russia and that Black Sea region. I would like to think that conflict's coming to an end. I think the thing that's really signaling that for me is sort of the collapse in the Russian ruble and the drop we've seen in that in the last 6 weeks, particularly sort of the events we've seen in Syria are sort of signaling some weakness there on Russia's part. So I'd like to think early in the new year we'll bring that conflict to some sort of resolution on that. That said, that's still going to be some problems. But that economic situation in Russia tied with the Ukraine, I think puts a bit of risk on top of that. That on top of the trade concerns, particularly for soybeans in China. Biggest question I've been getting is what's all this tariffs mean? And I think we need to move away from sort of the classical academic game theory sense of the impact of tariffs. versus a more strategic application. And I think it can be quite effective in today's environment on that. But it was a bit hard to get excited about wheat prices, but I think it'll follow corn higher in the next few months.
And just on a side note, if your currency is collapsing, if it's low value, that generally signifies in-country high inflation, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, yeah, you got probably 30% inflation in Russia at the moment. If you want to borrow money down there, it's going to cost you in the high 20s, 30% annual interest. You just can't do business there anymore. But that's exactly right.
Which means Russia has an incentive to come in with this new administration and probably end that conflict so they can try to right their ship.
Yeah. Just on the currency, the Fed's expected to cut their interest rates maybe 0.5%, but that'll help the U.S. economy a bit. We're currently seeing the U.S. dollar index above 107, which is fairly strong. It's been higher than that in the last couple of weeks, but that's a strong number. We'll see how the economists sort of move that forward. If the Fed drops the interest rate, that's actually bearish the dollar value. But I think it's a reflection of a lot of the other economies around the world are just pretty weak. And we've seen that reflected in the poor export demand last year. But with the supplies not there, it's going to be a problem. So we continue to see a strong U.S. dollar. The other economic indicator I like to talk about is your dry bulk index. That's a good leading indicator of the health of the global economy. We've seen that make some new lows here, a couple-year lows. It's down to 1,100. And the biggest driver of that is demand for coal and iron ore into China. And what that's telling me is that manufacturing sector is extremely weak. The other thing that does is it makes the U.S., where it's freight disadvantaged into those high-value markets into Asia, China, particularly competing with the Australians as well as even the South Americas. It lessens that disadvantage we have. Right now, U.S. corn's cheapest corn and cheapest wheat should be pricing in to a lot of those markets. And we're going to see good demand come out of there. So that transportation is working in our advantage. And that said, the Mississippi River has sort of solved itself. It's expected to maybe put some draft restrictions on by the end of the year. And we've seen the cost of rail cars, particularly for Western grain belt, come back down to par, no premium on that. And that's sort of indicating we've resolved that rail car transportation issue with Mexico that we've seen or those border crossings.
And that transportation issue helps on soybeans. And
yes.
We have had, this last week, a little bit of weakness in soybeans, about 60 or so, 50, 60 million bushels preliminarily. But we have been running 88, 89. And really, when you look at the U.S. domestic supply-demand balance sheet, there were no changes in that December report other than the price from $10.80 down to $10.20. And as we talked about, that's where the lead futures contracts are below $10. So that's kind of where all that's going to. And Guy, I would say that I'm going to set you up to take a shot at the USDA projections for 24-25 when it comes to soybeans. So there's a projection for world ending stocks to be up about 20 million metric tons in the 24-25 marketing year, but that's resting on the projection for a large Brazilian, especially soybean crop that we won't be harvesting until January, February, March, and beyond. So anyway, we've always got that timing issue. And frankly, the strength in U.S. exports going down the river system you're just talking about, we have a limited window until about January, February especially, when the South American supplies start to come. Comments?
Yeah, I'll sort of back into South America and the soybeans, looking at China. USDA left China's crush unchanged at about 98 million metric tons. Although they did increase their imports, they're expecting Sino Grain to buy a bit more soybeans into there. I think they're sort of front running the risk of tariffs coming on or a bit of a trade issue there. So we've seen some reasonable buying to unknown, but probably going into China on that at the moment, which makes me fairly optimistic. The other thing with freight coming down, we're just a couple dollars freight disadvantage going from Brazil through Center Gulf, still freight advantage off the PNW. So that drop in freights helped that as well. That sort of gives me an opportunity, I think, to talk about Brazil versus the U.S. when we talk about export competitiveness, and something that I sort of talk about increasingly frequently on why does the U.S. struggle to compete, and why are we the supplier of last resort and the preferred storer of grain. And I think it's increasingly important to understand the market dynamics there. The global commodity prices price off Chicago and U.S. Center Gulf. And if a country like Brazil, Argentina, Europe, or even Australia on the wheat, if they want to move grain, they calculate the U.S. price and then discount their price a couple dollars a ton to the CNF final destination. If they don't want to sell the commodity or they're running out, then they price it higher than the U.S. The thing to keep in mind is the U.S. stores world supply of grain. Why is that? It takes four things to be a store of grain. First, you need short-term money to finance the inventory. Secondly, you need long-term finance to finance the construction of the asset or the warehouse you're going to store it in. And U.S. is very competitive in capital markets around the world, particularly in countries like Brazil, particularly in places like Argentina, even in countries such as Australia. Thirdly, and most importantly, is the capacity to manage price risk from one season to the next. And we have an evolved, sophisticated futures exchange and derivative markets that lets the country elevator or the trade carry that inventory from one season to the next. And we saw that, if we remember the markets 3 months ago, just ahead of harvest, we saw very, very large carries for a number of reasons, expecting a big crop, tight storage space, and the market was in big carries. Since then, we've got that commodity put away. It's in store. We've seen those board spreads collapse. We've seen basis rally as transportation became loose, and the market's got to buy that away from the country elevator. So we have that market structure to manage that price risk one season to the next. And your country elevators should make a little money this year carrying that out. But they're not going to let go of that until they get paid a full season's return for storing that grain.
So following what you said, even though it's frustrating for our farmers, we're about the only major country in the world that has the storage and the finance and the ability to manage inventory. So what that means, when we get really high prices, it's probably more at the end of the marketing year.
Well, we have an established market-based approach to do that. The contrast to that is China. And we always talk about the big inventories China's carrying. And in that situation, the government does all that. The other fourth key component in there is you need the human resource and the people skills to merchandise that and manage that. And that's very, very U.S.-centric there as well. But at the end of the day, your exporting countries like Brazil and Argentina, they're going to price their grain and compete until they run out. So if you want to know when they're going to run out, take their monthly export capacity, divide it into their production, and they'll run out in that amount of time. And as their production increases, it just takes them longer to run out till that market comes back to the U.S.
Dan, Guy, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today and give us our grain market update.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien and the senior economist at the IGP Institute, Guy Allen. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we end our Friday show with a weather update with K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip, thanks for joining us today.
You betcha. Thanks for having me.
Chip, looking at this past weekend, and it was pretty warm outside.
Yeah, it got beautiful. We were looking at temperatures in the mid-60s in places, and very light wind over the weekend. And you knew it set us up for a change in the weather to come, because that's just the pattern we've been in. You know, get warm for a couple of days, and then a cold front comes through, and breezy northerly winds, and we're much colder, at least feel much colder. And that's what happened. After that warm weekend, we had a pretty drastic cool off this week. And I say drastic, I'm highlighting the italics around my parentheses around that. Is it's not really drastic when we look at the overall the warm temperatures this weekend was drastic, but the cold not so much. Where we were 20 degrees above normal with those warmer temperatures, where the cold we're still running about 3 to 4 degrees above normal for this time of the year. And yes, some of the more afternoons have been a little bit cooler, a couple degrees cooler than normal, but overnight we're still warmer than normal. And so even despite these cooler conditions after that warm weekend, we're still keeping above normal temperatures.
With the cool temperatures, did we see any snow?
Yeah, we had a weak wave. With a couple of these fronts, we had just enough moisture to work with, and some of the cold air aloft to help develop some instability. that created convective showers, just weak convective showers that led to some snow showers and snow squalls in a couple of places where it snowed briefly for 10, 15 minutes, and it was heavy enough at times that we got some accumulating snow kind of in a band that went from north central Kansas around the Belleville, Scandia area, south and east through Manhattan, and then down into east central Kansas, kind of that Bourbon County area. Not enough to really measure a whole lot. A couple isolated areas had about a half inch, but other than that, it was just a dusting, and in places it was mixed with some freezing rain. It's just a good reminder that we are in winter precipitation season, despite not seeing much of that yet. And these low-end events, these small totals, can end up being high impact if they're not timed well. So I really caution people to look at the forecast, and if we do start seeing the introduction of frozen precipitation in any way, shape, or form, if it's not a high probability, don't just push it aside. Pay attention to when the timing is and plan around that, because some of those, the highest impact events are those light rounds of precipitation, not the big snowstorms. So just be cognizant. It is winter, and you have to adjust appropriately if there is the weather conditions that push you to maybe leave early or plan for a longer travel.
How has the recent precipitation impacted the drought monitor?
Very minimally. We have seen precipitation maybe 100th, 200th of an inch. So we've been pretty much dry since mid-November. A lot of places in the state are going 25, 30 days now without a wetting rain or a 1/10 of an inch of moisture. That's perfectly normal for this time of year. We average anywhere from a 1/10 of an inch to 4/10 of an inch on average. That's from west to east. Any general week in December, this is our driest time of the year. We don't see a lot of moisture. So the drought monitor is staying pretty consistent. There has been some subtle changes, especially in southwest Kansas, just to adjust it more to those long-term improvements that we saw over November and really even in parts of the summer that were just now catching up statistically. But otherwise, still over 60% of the state is in D0, abnormally dry conditions or worse, with about 30% of the state in moderate drought. That's mostly along and north of I-70.
Chip, what are we seeing for a forecast?
Yeah, so temperatures are going to continue to bounce around. We have a weak system that's moving through Saturday morning. They'll bring about a 1/4 inch of precip for the eastern part of the state. Otherwise, I don't really see any foreseeable decent amount of moisture through Christmas. So odds of a white Christmas are pretty darn low. Temperature's going to fluctuate. I think we're going to end Christmas or at least get to Christmas on probably a warmer than average note, with the CPC, Climate Prediction Center, calling for pretty good high favorability towards above normal temperatures through Christmas.
Chip, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Yep, thanks for having me.
That was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. That's all we have for you this week on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you on Monday.